The murder inside the apartment. February 24th, 1986. A security guard dialed 911 in panic. Sherri Rasmussen's husband had just returned home from work and walked straight into a nightmare. His wife was lying on the living room floor, covered in blood. The furniture was overturned, glass shattered. The whole apartment looked like a war zone. When LAPD detectives arrived, the crime scene spoke for itself. The sliding glass door had been smashed, drawers were pulled open, and a crystal vase lay shattered next to the victim's body. Sherri's clothes were torn, her arms were bruised. She had clearly fought for her life before being shot twice in the chest at close range. The struggle was violent and desperate. A blanket had been thrown over her body, likely by her husband in a state of shock. Her face was swollen, her lips split. She had been beaten, then executed. From the first look, investigators labeled it a burglary gone wrong. Some jewelry was missing, a few electronics had vanished. Sherri's BMW was gone. But days later, the car was found abandoned just a few blocks away, still in good condition. Nothing about this crime felt like the work of a random thief. Even stranger, not a single neighbor heard gunshots or saw an unfamiliar face entering or leaving the building. Whoever killed Sherri knew this apartment. They moved fast, they were calm, and they were merciless. Sherri Rasmussen, 29 years old, a bright and accomplished nurse, had been murdered in the place she believed was safest, her own home. But what happened after the murder was even more chilling than the crime itself. Within days, LAPD investigators quickly locked onto the burglary theory. No clear suspects, no deep dive into her personal life, no real investigation, just a tidy report and a case filed away. And so, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen disappeared into silence. Her parents refused to accept the easy explanation. Sherri had confided in them about a woman, someone jealous, threatening, stalking her, someone dangerous. But when they told the police, no one listened. The killer vanished into the world unbothered. No arrest, no suspicion, no justice. For more than 2 decades, the case remained frozen, until one small trace, a single DNA sample left at the crime scene, shattered everything. The murderer wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a burglar, it was a fellow cop, an LAPD officer who had once sworn to protect the very city she bled. This wasn't just a murder. It was a story about a crime buried beneath the system meant to bring justice, and proof that even when justice sleeps, it never dies. The life of the victim and the shadow growing closer. Before her name became tied to one of the most infamous cold cases in the United States, Sherri Rasmussen was a young woman full of energy, intelligence, and kindness. Born in 1957 in California, she grew up in a loving family where everyone believed she had a brilliant future ahead. From a young age, Sherri showed natural leadership. She was always the one helping others, working hard, and setting high standards for herself. Her career path was nothing short of extraordinary. By the time she was not even 30, Sherri had already become the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, a position many people spend a lifetime chasing. Sherri wasn't just good at her job. She was respected, admired, and loved by everyone around her. She was strong, calm, and fiercely independent. Life seemed to be unfolding perfectly. A stable career, bright dreams, and a love story straight out of a fairy tale. In the early 1980s, Sherri met John Rutan, a young, handsome, and polite engineer. Their relationship grew quickly and deeply. They were the kind of couple people envied, happy, stable, and full of plans. They dreamed of a warm home, children, and a peaceful future together. But there was something Sherri didn't see coming. Long before she entered the picture, there had already been a shadow tied to John's past. Before Sherri, John had dated another woman, Stephanie Lazarus. And Stephanie was not just anyone. She was a young LAPD officer, strong, confident, and ambitious. Their relationship was casual and had ended years before, but Stephanie had never truly let go. When she learned John was engaged to Sherri, jealousy consumed her. She started appearing unexpectedly at places Sherri frequented, outside John's house, at the hospital where Sherri worked, and one day, she confronted Sherri directly, warning her to be careful. Sherri confided in her parents that she felt like she was being watched. Stephanie wasn't just an ex-girlfriend. She was armed, trained, and had access to police resources. This wasn't just romantic rivalry, it was a real, dangerous threat. John tried to reassure Sherri, telling her it was just the past and that Stephanie would eventually move on. But deep inside, Sherri couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. In January 1986, just weeks before the murder, Sherri told her parents that Stephanie had shown up at her workplace again. Her stare was cold, her presence was deliberate, and Sherri's instincts were screaming something bad was coming. Their wedding still took place as planned. The couple moved into a cozy condo in Van Nuys, a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles. It seemed like a fresh beginning, but the shadow of Stephanie Lazarus did not disappear. It was only waiting for the right moment. Each small sign, the icy stare, the coincidental encounters, the subtle warnings, was a red flag. But at the time, no one could imagine how close danger really was. Sherri kept living her life as usual, going to work, loving her husband, planning her future. No one knew that this intelligent, accomplished, vibrant young woman had only a few short weeks left before everything she had built would be torn apart. The day of the murder, Monday, February 24th, 1986, a quiet, sunny morning in Los Angeles. Sunlight poured through the window of the Van Nuys condominium that Sherri Rasmussen shared with her husband, John Rutan. No one could have imagined that this ordinary morning would be the last day of her life. John left for work early, like any other day. He had no idea that just a few hours later, their home would become a crime scene soaked in blood. Sherri, feeling a little tired, decided to stay home. She planned to rest, read some professional materials, and handle a few work calls from her living room. The neighborhood was calm, the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. But around 10 a.m., a figure appeared near the building. No neighbors paid attention. No one realized that a tragedy was about to unfold. The exact moment the intruder entered is still unknown. The sliding glass door at the back of the apartment showed signs of being forced open. What followed was fast and violent. Detectives later concluded that the confrontation started in the living room, possibly when Sherri discovered the intruder. Sherri was a strong woman. She didn't run. She fought back. Evidence later showed a brutal struggle. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and blood smeared across the carpet. She was beaten repeatedly, but she resisted with everything she had. Investigators believe Sherri physically fought the killer, trying to escape or disarm them. A gun was fired, then a second shot. Both bullets struck Sherri Rasmussen in the chest at close range. The sound of the shots was muffled inside the apartment, not loud enough to alert the neighbors. The killer, calm and calculated, covered her body with a blanket. This act, according to criminal profilers, often indicates a personal connection between killer and victim. To stage the scene as a burglary, the killer ransacked drawers, grabbed a few pieces of jewelry, and drove off in Sherri's BMW. It was a cold, deliberate move to mislead the investigation. When John returned home in the early afternoon, he noticed Sherri's car was gone. He tried to call her but got no answer. Inside the apartment, he walked into a nightmare. Shattered glass, chaos everywhere, and Sherri's lifeless body lying on the floor, hidden under a blanket. LAPD officers rushed to the scene. The injuries, the struggle, the way the scene was staged. Nothing truly fit the narrative of a random burglary, but detectives quickly labeled it as a botched robbery, ignoring the deeper warning signs. No one seriously looked into the threat Sherri had reported from Stephanie Lazarus, the woman who had been stalking her. While Sherri's parents begged for answers, the real killer walked away freely, shielded by silence and a flawed investigation. No suspect, no arrest, just a closed file, and a family left with unbearable grief. But what the killer didn't know was that traces of their crime remained. Tiny drops of blood, strands of hair, hidden DNA. Those forgotten clues would one day become the key to exposing the truth. A brutal murder, a broken investigation, and a killer with a badge, living freely among the innocent for decades. A case misled and buried. That afternoon, just hours after John found his wife's lifeless body, Los Angeles police swarmed the scene. Flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet neighborhood, and the once peaceful condo turned into a chaotic crime scene. From the very beginning, investigators could tell this was no ordinary case. The sliding door at the back had been pried open, the apartment ransacked, and furniture overturned. But what struck many officers most was the sign of a fierce struggle inside the living room. This wasn't the work of a petty thief. It was the mark of someone determined or enraged. And yet, instead of pursuing multiple leads, the original detectives quickly settled on a single narrative: a botched burglary. They believed a burglar broke in, encountered Sherri, killed her, and then staged the scene to cover their tracks. Sherri's BMW was missing, which seemed to support their theory. But they never stopped to ask crucial questions. Why would a burglar fight so violently? Why cover the body with a blanket? And most importantly, why were there no signs of forced entry through the front door, only from the back? The Rasmussen family, though shattered, sensed something was wrong. From the beginning, Sherri had told them about a woman, Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer who had stalked and threatened her multiple times. Sherri's parents immediately told the detectives about this woman, but instead of taking it seriously, they brushed it off with vague nods and minimal notes. No formal interview with Stephanie was ever conducted. Several people remembered Sherri's unease about running into Stephanie at the hospital and even near her home. But those details never made it into the official case file. They were ignored. The forensic work also left huge gaps. Samples of blood, hair, and other trace evidence were collected from the scene, but in 1986, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The evidence was sealed and stored away, forgotten as the years passed. The official case file was shockingly thin. There was no expanded suspect list, no deeper probe inside the LAPD, even though the person Sherri feared most was a fellow officer. Within months, the case had essentially gone cold. John, consumed by grief, withdrew from the world. He couldn't comprehend how the woman he loved so fiercely was gone in an instant. Meanwhile, Sherri's parents refused to give up. They wrote letters, made calls, begged for follow-ups, but every year they heard the same line: no new leads. Slowly, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen faded from public memory. But deep inside a LAPD evidence storage room, those sealed samples remained, silent, untouched, waiting. Years passed. Technology advanced, and eventually, one overlooked piece of evidence, a tiny DNA sample, would shatter the old theory and point to a killer no one had dared to suspect. A clue from the past. Nearly 20 years had passed since Sherri Rasmussen's brutal murder. The case had long been buried deep within the cold case archives of the Los Angeles Police Department. But justice has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In the early 2000s, DNA technology advanced rapidly. Old unsolved cases suddenly had new hope. Among thousands of dusty case files, a special LAPD cold case unit began reviewing potential reopenings. When they opened Sherri Rasmussen's file, they immediately noticed something that didn't sit right. Inside a sealed evidence envelope were samples collected from the crime scene back in 1986. Blood, hair, and latent prints. None had ever been tested with modern DNA methods. Quietly, a lab technician processed the evidence. No one in the unit expected that the results would completely rewrite the case. The DNA results ruled out Sherri and her husband, John Rutan. That meant a third person had been in the apartment that day. More shocking still, the DNA belonged to a woman. In a single moment, the long-standing burglary gone wrong theory collapsed. Detectives began reviewing everyone who had connections to Sherri at the time. And then, one name brought the room to a standstill. Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer, John's former girlfriend, and the woman Sherri had reported for stalking and harassment before her death. An officer, a protector of the law, and now a potential prime suspect in a 20-year-old murder. If Lazarus really was the killer, it meant the murderer had been walking the halls of the LAPD for decades, wearing a badge, carrying a gun, and hiding in plain sight. The case was no longer just a cold file. It was now a political and institutional bomb. Any misstep could shatter the department's credibility. The investigative team decided to operate in complete secrecy. Only a handful of people were informed. They began covert surveillance on Lazarus, tracking her movements, watching her routine, and waiting for the perfect moment to collect her DNA. One day, she finished a drink and tossed the cup. Forensic specialists seized it immediately. When the DNA results came back, the room fell silent. 100% match. The DNA from Stephanie Lazarus matched the crime scene evidence from 1986. There was no doubt anymore. The killer had been one of their own. But arresting a seasoned LAPD officer wasn't like arresting any other suspect. Lazarus had allies, access to police systems, and intimate knowledge of investigative procedures. One wrong move, and she could destroy evidence or disappear entirely. The team began crafting a tactical arrest plan worthy of a high-stakes operation. Every detail, the time, location, personnel, was calculated with surgical precision. 2 decades of silence were about to end. The truth was ready to explode into the light, and it would shake the LAPD to its core. The Trap for a Killer with a Badge, June 2009. After months of covert surveillance and meticulous planning, the special LAPD task force was finally ready. They had DNA evidence that couldn't be disputed, a carefully crafted strategy, and a single objective: arrest Stephanie Lazarus, one of their own. They couldn't simply storm her house or arrest her in public. Lazarus wasn't just any suspect. She was a veteran police officer, armed, experienced, and well-connected inside the department. If she caught even the slightest hint of suspicion, she could destroy evidence or even fight back. Instead, they chose to strike from the inside. A small tactical unit positioned itself near her home as backup. Meanwhile, another team lured Lazarus to LAPD headquarters under the pretense of discussing a minor property case. Not a single word about Sherri Rasmussen. Lazarus agreed without hesitation. She walked into the building she had served for nearly 2 decades, completely unaware that every exit was under control. She was escorted to a small, windowless interrogation room. Once the door shut, it was locked from the outside. The trap had closed. At first, the conversation was casual, almost friendly, like an internal administrative chat. Lazarus appeared calm, even a little amused, confident in her familiarity with police procedures. But then the tone shifted. "Do you remember Sherri Rasmussen? Did you ever see her near the time of her death? Can you explain why your DNA was found at her crime scene in 1986? The color slowly drained from Lazarus's face. Her confident smile faltered. She tried to deflect, to control the conversation, to turn the questions back on the investigators. But they weren't there to talk. They were there to bring her down. The moment the lead detective uttered the words, 100% DNA match, Lazarus froze. She understood. There was no escape. No explanation that could erase biological evidence tying her to Sherri's murder. Moments later, the tactical team entered. Her service weapon was taken, and in a stunning, almost surreal scene, Stephanie Lazarus, a decorated LAPD officer, was handcuffed inside her own department. Colleagues were shocked. The press would soon explode the story across the nation. After 23 years, the Sherri Rasmussen case was officially reopened. A woman once seen as a hero cop was now the symbol of betrayal and hidden violence. For decades, Lazarus had lived a normal life: promotions, commendations, even marriage, while the Rasmussen family endured unbearable grief. But now, the past had caught up with her. The mask had cracked. The courtroom was next, but that moment, the sound of handcuffs clicking behind her back, marked the end of her long escape. The Trial of Truth. February 2012. 3 years after her arrest, Stephanie Lazarus finally walked into a Los Angeles courtroom. The Sherri Rasmussen case, once forgotten for more than 20 years, had now become a national spectacle. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, major news networks followed every development, and the country watched as a police officer stood trial for murder. Dressed in a dark suit, Lazarus appeared composed, but behind her cold expression was unmistakable tension. In the front row sat the Rasmussen family, parents who had spent nearly a quarter of a century waiting for this moment. The prosecution opened with a clear, piercing statement. First-degree murder fueled by jealousy, premeditation, and a calculated cover-up. They laid out the evidence: a 100% DNA match, witness statements, records of Lazarus stalking and threatening Sherri, and the initial police investigation that had suspiciously ignored her as a suspect. The defense tried to paint Lazarus as a dedicated, respected police officer, claiming the case was built on degraded evidence and unreliable memories. They leaned heavily on the 20-year gap between the murder and her arrest, attempting to sow doubt in the jurors' minds. But the prosecution struck back with overwhelming force. They detailed modern DNA analysis, physical evidence from the crime scene, and most importantly, Lazarus's pattern of harassment toward Sherri before the murder. A key piece of evidence was a bite mark on Sherri's arm, which forensic experts matched to Lazarus. When the image was shown in court, the room fell into a heavy, stunned silence. On the stand, Lazarus denied everything. She claimed not to remember, insisted she was innocent, and suggested she had been set up. But to the jury, the truth was clear. They weren't looking at a framed cop. They were looking at a woman who had hidden behind a badge to cover up a personal, brutal crime. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom with the verdict. The air was so thick that even the sound of paper rustling was sharp. We find the defendant, Stephanie Lazarus, guilty of first-degree murder. Lazarus closed her eyes. No tears, no words, just the quiet collapse of a carefully constructed lie. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 27 years. In the front row, Sherri's parents embraced. After more than 2 decades of relentless pursuit, justice had finally spoken. But justice did not erase the pain. It only illuminated the truth that had been buried for so long. The Lazarus case became a seismic moment in American law enforcement, a chilling reminder that sometimes the killer isn't a stranger, but someone wearing a badge. It exposed cracks in the system, forced departments to reevaluate internal accountability, and proved how DNA technology can resurrect justice from silence.